Hey everybody, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast here looking at another game that I played on the free internet chess server. Let's just get into it because I don't have much of an introduction here. So my opponent opens up with pawn to d4, the queen's pawn's opening, and whenever I see the queen pawn's opening, I almost always go into the Dutch defense, which is pawn to f5. More specifically, I almost always get into the Dutch stonewall defense, which you'll see here in a moment. Much more common in this position is, I think, maybe knight out to g6 or just pushing the pawn to d5. However, that can lead to the queen's gambit, or the knight out to g6 can lead to the Nimzowitsch defense, and I'm just not well versed in either of those lines. So I stick with the Dutch Stonewall defense for the moment, just because that's what I'm familiar with. From here, my opponent plays knight out to f3. I play pawn to d5. He develops his knight to c3, and I play pawn to e6. He jumps his knight into e5 immediately, and I should stop here and say that one of the common features of the Dutch Stonewall defense is that the square here on e5 becomes what is known as a hole. For those of you who don't know, a hole is a square which can no longer be attacked by any pawns, excluding pawn captures. So if the pawn on c, if the c pawn or the g pawn here, if either were to capture towards the center, theoretically they would be attacking the knight here on e5. However, excluding those captures, you'll notice that my d and my f pawns have both advanced to the 5th rank, which means that the square here on e5 is a hole. This is what usually happens in the Dutch Stonewall. Just so for those people who are kind of curious, it is something that you're gonna have to put up with. From here, I develop my knight out to f6. He plays pawn to e3, and I develop my bishop to d6. And here, my opponent plays a very strange move and retreats the knight to f3. I think better would have been simply to continue with his own development and play bishop d2, and both sides could have castled. Because if I capture this knight here, I'm doing two things. One, I'm giving up my bishop pair, and two, this pawn is going to recapture, and then I'm going to have to move my knight. That can be a little problematic, instead of rocking the boat, as it were. In this position, I would have been just inclined to continue with my development. However, if you go back after I develop the bishop, my opponent jumps his knight back to f3. I guess he was afraid I was going to capture it or something. From here, I develop my own knight to d7, and my opponent makes a mistake which I myself am guilty of making several times, especially when I play an opening or a defense that I'm not too familiar with. And that is being a little over aggressive and overextending your pieces too early in the opening, and playing out. In this instance, my opponent plays the bishop to b5. Now, I think a better move would have been if he had just played his bishop to e2, and then we could have both castled, and the game could have continued. But playing out to b5, if I'm playing white in this position, I have to ask myself, what am I hoping to gain from this position? Um, if you look at it, the natural move to play is simply pawn to c6, which I do play, and that is immediately attacking the bishop. So the bishop is now going to have to move twice. So what was the point of bringing it to b5 only to have to retreat it back to either e2 or d3? Now, unfortunately for my opponent, pulling it back to, say, d3 would have been better than what he played. What he played was bishop back to a4. And this was a big mistake because this is going to allow me to take the bishop effectively out of the game. I play pawn to b5, attacking the bishop. He has to pull the bishop back to b3. I push my a pawn. He decides to give his bishop an escape square and plays pawn to a3. And then from here, I just push the a pawn one more time, and my opponent has to tuck the bishop back into a2. And with the pawn structure the way it is, there's no way for this bishop to really liberate itself from the square. It's doing a whole lot of nothing. It's effectively out of the game. And as you'll see as the game progresses here, that doesn't change for my opponent. So what has transpired here? First of all, my opponent has effectively lost a piece, but also in giving me a lot of tempos, I've been able to create this pawn chain, and I've gained a little bit of space on the queen side of the board. All of this probably could have been avoided by playing something like, if we go back here, simply bishop to e2, because again, you're not overextending your pieces, you're not getting too aggressive. And again, I do want to say that I make that mistake myself when I play openings and defenses that I'm not familiar with. So I'm trying to learn from my opponent's mistakes as well. So from here, after he plays his bishop back to a2, I castle. My opponent plays knight to g5, which is attacking the base of my pawn structure here. And from here, I play the queen to e7. Now, I could have easily played the queen to e8. However, I wanted to keep it on this diagonal because if this knight ever moves, if these knights ever move, I should say, the queen is going to be able to come out to this diagonal. And with this knight sitting here on g5, unless it jumps back to f3 again, there's not going to be any piece immediately that's going to be able to kick my queen off. And I just wanted to keep my queen on this diagonal for future play, as opposed to moving it over to e8, where it would have been protecting the base pawn here. However, pulling it out along this diagonal, you'll notice that the white queen is conveniently protecting this square here on e5. Sorry, h5. So I play queen c7 to protect the base pawn. From here, my opponent castles, and I unleash a bit of a tactic. I capture the bishop on I capture with the bishop on h2, hitting the king with a check. Now my opponent captures the bishop, and then I hit another check with my knight, and after my opponent pulls the knight back to g1, I capture the knight here on g5 because it was unprotected. And you'll notice that I'm up a pawn, and now my opponent's structure here, his castle position, is a little weak because now there's this semi-open h-file, and I have my queen in the vicinity. Now from here, my opponent made kind of a mistake or a blunder, whatever you want to call it. I think maybe he was flustered or something, and what he played was pawn to f3. Now before I go over the rest of the game, let me just say that I think a better move for my opponent would have been to play something like queen to f3, because then if I try to get my queen over to h4 to hit a checkmate, he can block with the queen, avoid the checkmate, and then I can pull the knight back to h6, which is keeping this f6 square free for the rook to lift up and maybe hit a check at some point. And my opponent's castle position is still pretty shot. However, there's no immediate threat to the checkmate. Maybe that would have been something that my opponent could have played. Instead, what my opponent played was f3, which is attacking the knight. However, you'll notice that by pushing the pawn to f3, it is vacating the defense of this pawn here on e3. And now you'll notice that it is attacked twice and defended only once. My knight and my queen are attacking it, and it is defended only by this bishop. So I play knight capture on e3. And you'll notice that I'm doing a couple of things here. One, I'm forking the queen and the rook here, and two, I'm attacking this pawn here on g2. That would be checkmate if I was able to get my queen to it. So my opponent pretty much has no choice but to capture with his bishop, and then once I do, I recapture with my queen. And you'll notice that here I am actually up 2 pawns in the position. From here, my opponent pulls the king over to h1, and I lift my rook up to f6. This is threatening a checkmate. If my rook hits h6, that's going to be game over. So to give his king an escape square, my opponent plays g3. From here, I still hit the check with my rook. The king goes to g2, and I pull my queen back to g5 just to kind of get it a little bit closer to the rook here. Maybe I can get them working together along this semi-open h-file. Also, just to avoid any sort of tactical shots or anything, just to kind of keep my queen out of harm's way. From here, my opponent plays knight over to e2, and here I kind of make a mistake and I play pawn to h5. I think a better move for me would have been maybe knight to f6, because then that's bringing another piece closer to the action. The reason pawn to e5 is a mistake is because my opponent can actually just capture that pawn. Now, when I played this move, the reason that I played it was because I wanted to prepare this pawn thrust, which would be attacking this pinned pawn. And I thought, well, even if he captures it, I can just recapture with my knight, and then I've brought my knight into the action. However, what I didn't see when I played this move was that white can actually capture that pawn, and then once I recapture with the knight, pawn to f4, and I have to save the queen here, and I'm going to lose the knight. From here I can play the queen to g4, he can capture my knight, I can hit a check. He can actually maybe block with the rook to f3, and then I can capture this passed pawn just to avoid it from making any trouble. And you'll notice that the position, actually I should say the material here is actually dead equal. I have 3 pawns for a piece. However, the attack has just been a little dampened. The king is still exposed, but the white king is still exposed. But the question is, how do I take advantage of that? I don't have enough attacking pieces in the vicinity, and this queen can come into the action. This rook is pretty nicely placed. The knight here is protecting the pawn here on g3. So yeah, this is why I think playing the pawn to e5 was a mistake. Fortunately for me, however, my opponent missed all that completely and simply played pawn to c3, trying to protect his center pawn. From here, play continued with me pushing the pawn to f4. One of the cardinal rules in chess, in tactical chess, is to attack a pinned piece and not to capture it, because the more you can attack it, the more pressure you put on it, the more complicated you make the position for your opponent, and just the easier it'll be for you later on. Makes your opponent sweat out a little bit. From here, my opponent plays pawn to g4, and now I play the knight out to f6. My opponent plays rook over to h1, but instead of a knee-jerk reaction like maybe capturing the rook, which would have let him activate the queen and kind of get it on the semi-open h-file down into my castle position, I know that the rook is actually protected adequately enough for the moment, so I ignore that and I push pawn to e4. Now, this is kind of a tricky move, because if my opponent captures the pawn, it looks like my opponent can capture it, and if he does, what actually happens is a mate in 4. There are actually 2 mate in 4 patterns from here that, if you want to pause the video before I go over them, you're welcome to do so. But for the first mate in 4 is queen to g4. From here, the king can play to g2. I can hit a check with the knight here on h4. The king only has 1 square to go to, well, 2 squares to go to f1 or e1, but it doesn't make any difference. Let's just say the king goes to e1. From here, I can capture the rook, and the only way to block the check is with the knight, and after I do that, rook capture on g1 is checkmate. Alternatively, if we go back, one more checkmate in 4 is from this position after the queen captures on g4. White might try to block with the knight. However, what that is going to allow me to do is capture the knight. King only has 1 square to go to, that's f1. After I capture here, the king only has 1 square to go to, which is e2, and then from here, the queen over to e3 is checkmate. So those were 2 checkmate in 4s that would have occurred if my opponent, if we go back here, if my opponent had captured the pawn here on e4. However, my opponent did not capture, and instead, in an effort to maybe alleviate the pressure, plays rook capture on h6. Now, I actually don't capture the rook back right away, and instead what I do is I play, I hit a couple of checks on the king. I play pawn to e3. The king has to recapture. Once it does, I play bishop out to g4, hitting a check. The king plays to f2. I hit another check with the knight, forcing the king back even further. The king goes to e1, and now I capture the rook, and my opponent plays to f1 in this position, but from here my opponent actually resigns before I'm able to play my next move. And the reason is that there's nothing he's going to be able to do to stop a checkmate. For example, I can play the queen out to h2, which is converging 2 pieces on this f2 square. He can try to protect the f2 square by playing queen over to e1, but from here, bishop to h3 is checkmate. So yeah, that's why in this position my opponent resigned. So yeah, it was a good game. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, the Dutch Stonewall defense is definitely a defense that you can look into for yourself. There's a really good video on it from J Roby Chess. You can certainly feel free to check that out. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and questions and comments, of course, are welcome. And take care. Bye.